Right now, the United States is quietly asking Congress for an additional $200 billion to fund a military operation that, you know, the public largely believes has been paused.
Yeah, the contrast is really
It
jarring.
is. Because at this exact moment, thousands of airborne troops and Marines are actually moving toward bases in the Middle East. And the primary target for this massive mobilization isn't the mainland of Iran.
Right, which is what most people would assume.
Exactly. It's actually a tiny, isolated rock sitting just 15 kilometers off the coast that happens to control 90% of the Iranian economy.
It's a huge leverage point.
It really is. So today, we are unpacking the Kharg Island gambit and analyzing why boots on the ground in Iran is suddenly looking, well, inevitable, despite some very recent, very public hopes for peace. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me. We have a lot to cover today.
We do. We've got a formidable stack of sources to explore for you today, including these really deep strategic analyses titled The Kharg Island Dilemma and Escalation Traps.
Yeah, and we're pairing those with a really rigorous intelligence and tracking breakdown from TLDR News Global.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to basically cut through the geopolitical noise. We're going to separate the dramatic headlines from the cold, mechanical realities of military logistics.
Because the logistics tell the real story here.
They always do. We'll explain what a ground operation would actually look like and critically trace the exact mathematical lines from a conflict in the Persian Gulf directly to your wallet.
But before we move into the actual mechanics of these troop movements,
Yeah.
we really need to establish the parameters of our analysis today.
Yeah, that's a crucial point.
Because the sources we are examining today contain some highly politically charged content. I mean, they detail specific, often aggressive policy demands from the current U.S. administration and equally uncompromising counter-demands from the Iranian government.
Right, not to mention explicit plans for potentially devastating military action.
Exactly. So we want to make it incredibly clear that neither of us here is taking a side.
Absolutely not.
We are not endorsing any of the viewpoints, political maneuvers, or, military strategies outlined in these documents. Our sole objective is to impartially report, deconstruct, and synthesize the ideas contained in the original source material.
We're just looking at the blueprints.
Yeah, we are examining the architecture of the situation, not adjudicating the politics behind it.
Okay, let's unpack this. We really have to start with a brief overview of the sheer whiplash happening right now between the diplomatic narrative and the military reality.
The whiplash is intense.
It's crazy. Barely 48 hours ago, the U.S. president announced a 5-day pause on strikes against Iranian energy infrastructure. And they cited very good and productive conversations with Tehran.
Which, for a moment, made it look like a de-escalation off-ramp was finally being built.
Right, like maybe we were backing away from the edge, but then
that narrative just dissolved almost immediately.
literally overnight.
Yeah. The Iranian government publicly and categorically denied that any such negotiations had even taken place.
Wow, so they just flat out said it didn't happen.
Exactly. So you have this incredibly strange situation where the diplomatic channels are publicly broadcasting a pause, but the satellite imagery and the logistical movements on the ground are broadcasting a massive escalation.
Which brings us to the phrase that historically sends markets into an absolute panic. Boots on the ground.
Yeah, those 4 words change everything.
They really do, because when the average person hears that the U.S. is sending troops to Iran, the immediate mental image is like D-Day.
Right. They picture millions of soldiers pouring across borders.
Yeah, exactly. A massive armored thrust into Tehran, this giant World War II-style campaign of total conquest. But our sources are incredibly explicit that this mental model is completely wrong.
It is entirely disconnected from modern military reality. I mean, a full-scale invasion of the Iranian mainland is a logistical near impossibility under current conditions.
Why is that? Just the sheer size of it.
Size and geography. Look at
Yeah.
the map. Iran isn't a flat desert plains country like Iraq. It is fortified by some of the most punishing terrain on Earth.
Like the mountain ranges?
Yes, specifically the Zagros mountain range, which basically acts as a massive natural fortress against any kind of armored columns trying to push inland.
So tanks are just a no-go.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Plus, you are dealing with a geographically massive nation, a population nearing 90 million people, these vast urban centers.
Yeah.
And this is key military infrastructure that has spent 40 years intentionally burying itself deep underground.
Right, so you can't just roll in A campaign of that magnitude would require a mobilization footprint we really haven't seen in decades.
You'd need 1 million troops, easily.
At least. You would see heavy armor being loaded onto ships from ports in Texas and Georgia for months on end. It wouldn't be a secret.
No, it would be the most visible thing in the world. And you would need a sustained domestic political campaign to prepare the American public for a multi-year, multi-trillion-dollar occupation.
And none of that infrastructure or political will exists right now.
Right. Therefore, when the strategic analyses point toward boots on the ground, they're defining a very, very different type of warfare.
So what are we actually looking at?
We are talking about a limited ground operation. This is the deployment of highly specialized forces tied to a narrow, sharply defined military or economic objective.
Okay, so it's not about regime change.
No, the goal isn't to conquer the state. The goal is to surgically seize a specific pressure point.
And the hard numbers of the current buildup perfectly match that profile of a surgical yet still massive pressure campaign.
The TLDR news breakdown on this is fascinating.
It is. Let's break down the actual units moving into U.S. bases in Israel and Jordan because the composition of this force tells a very specific story. First, we have the Army's 82nd Airborne Division's Immediate Response Force.
Which is roughly 3,000 soldiers.
Right. And to understand the significance of the 82nd Airborne moving, you have to look at how they operate. This isn't just a standard infantry unit.
No, the Immediate Response Force is designed specifically to deploy anywhere on the globe within 18 hours.
18 hours, that's incredibly fast.
It's wild. Logistically, that means having C-17 transport aircraft fully fueled, gear palletized, and paratroopers essentially sleeping next to their weapons.
So they're always on a hair trigger.
Exactly. When they activated, they fly across the ocean, they conduct mid-air refueling, which is incredibly complex, and they drop directly into a contested environment to seize a piece of terrain, usually an airfield or a strategic choke point.
They are the ultimate door kickers.
Yeah, they break the door down.
But they aren't going alone. The sources also track the deployment of roughly 2,200 U.S. Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, or MEU.
The MEU is a critical piece of this puzzle.
Right, and they are moving into the region alongside amphibious assault vehicles, specifically noting the USS Tripoli and the USS New Orleans. On top of that, an additional 2,000 sailors are entering the theater.
So the pairing of the airborne and a Marine Expeditionary Unit is the critical tell here. And MEU brings amphibious breaching capabilities.
Meaning they attack from the water.
Exactly. They operate from ships, using hovercraft and helicopters to project force from the sea directly onto land.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So when you combine paratroopers dropping from the sky with Marines storming a beachhead, you are looking at the exact doctrinal template for seizing an island or a heavily defended coastal installation.
And to add the final piece to this tactical puzzle, open source flight tracking data reveals approximately 45 military transport flights moving from the continental U.S. to the Middle East since March 12th.
45 flights is a massive logistical bridge.
It's huge, and the analyses note that these flights are originating from specific bases known to house elite special forces units.
Ah, so there's your vanguard.
Right. So you have the special forces to execute the highly complex initial breach, the airborne to drop in and secure the perimeter, and the Marines to hit the beaches and hold the line.
It is a perfectly tailored force for a very specific type of mission. But, the military movements are only half the equation here.
What's the other half?
The financial signals, and they are arguably much louder. They point toward a conflict that the U.S. anticipates will be incredibly resource-intensive.
Okay, let's do the math on the money, because this blew my mind. The U.S. administration's request to Congress for an additional $200 billion is just staggering.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that number.
It really is. I mean, the entire base budget for the U.S. military last year was just under $1 trillion. We are looking at a 20% overnight increase to the largest defense budget in the world.
And you have to ask why a supposedly limited operation requires that kind of capital.
Right. If you're not invading the whole country, why do you need $200 billion?
The answer lies in the mechanics of asymmetric warfare. The United States fights with highly exquisite, incredibly expensive technology. Iran, on the other hand, fights with cheap, mass-produced systems.
So we're talking about the difference between, like, a $4 million Patriot interceptor missile and a $20,000 Shahed drone.
Precisely. If Iran launches a swarm of 100 drones, it costs them perhaps $2 million.
Which is nothing in military terms.
Nothing. But to shoot down that swarm, The U.S. Navy and air defense batteries might expend $400 million worth of interceptor missiles.
Oh my God.
Yeah. The economic burn rate for the United States in this type of conflict is astronomical.
Yeah.
The administration isn't asking for $200 billion to go buy new tanks. They're asking for it to replenish the incredibly expensive munitions they know they will burn through just trying to defend these limited operations.
That makes so much sense. And when pressed on this massive budget request amid these supposed peace talks, the administration's public response was simply that the money is, quote, always nice to have.
Which is quite the understatement.
Yeah, slightly. But behind closed doors, the diplomatic back channels tracked by TLDR News tell a very different story. U.S. military officials have reportedly instructed their Israeli counterparts to prepare for at least another 2 weeks of war.
Which contradicts the public pause.
Entirely. The public narrative of a pause is acting as a diplomatic smokescreen, while the logistical and financial architecture for a strike is locked into place.
Which brings us to the operational focal point. If the U.S. has assembled this highly specialized amphibious and airborne force, and they've requested the capital to sustain them under heavy fire, where exactly are they going?
Right. What's the target?
We need to examine the most notable case in this strategic stack, Kharg Island.
Kharg Island is the prime target. According to the strategic analyses, it is an objective the U.S. has flirted with seizing since the 1980s, and U.S. military assets actually struck the area earlier this month.
We really need to physically map this out for the listener, because the geography is key.
Okay, let's do it. Kharg Island is this tiny piece of rock in the Persian Gulf, sitting just 15 kilometers, which is about 9 miles off the coast of the Iranian mainland.
But its physical size is completely irrelevant compared to its economic footprint. Kharg Island is the terminal that processes approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports.
90%, that's almost their entire export economy.
90% of the lifeblood of the Iranian state flows through the pipelines of that single tiny island. The revenue generated there is what allows Tehran to withstand global sanctions.
Right.
It funds their domestic government, and it sustains their sprawling network of military proxies across the region.
So if we think about the Iranian war economy as like a massive sprawling digital network, right? A full mainland invasion is like trying to individually hack and dismantle millions of computers across the entire country.
It's an impossible, exhausting task.
Exactly. But Kharg Island is the primary server rack sitting completely exposed in the parking lot.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah. So the U.S. military's plan isn't to dismantle the network computer by computer. The plan is to send a team of Navy SEALs and Marines to just seize the server rack and threaten to pull the power supply.
The appeal of the Kharg Island gambit to military planners is obvious. It offers a geographically confined objective that yields disproportionately massive strategic leverage.
You don't have to occupy Tehran, you just have to occupy the oil terminal.
Exactly. But the sources highlight massive structural flaws in this gambit.
Wait, really? Because it sounds like a foolproof plan on paper.
On paper, sure, but seizing the server rack doesn't instantly crash the system. First off, Iran has redundancy built into its export architecture. Kharg is the crown jewel, absolutely, but it isn't the only terminal.
Ah, okay, so they have backups.
Yes. The intelligence reports point to alternative facilities at Lavon, Siri, and Keshem Islands, as well as the Jask terminal, which is strategically located outside the volatile Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, so if the U.S. takes Kharg, Iran can just route their oil through these other terminals.
Well, those backup terminals cannot handle the full 90% volume of Kharg.
Right.
But they possess enough capacity to keep a baseline of revenue flowing.
Got it.
So taking Kharg inflicts catastrophic economic pain, but it does not guarantee immediate capitulation. They can survive, barely, but they can survive.
And the secondary flaw is much more dangerous, honestly, and it comes down to a fundamental rule of warfare. Taking an island is easy compared to holding an island.
Holding it is the real nightmare.
Right. Let's walk through the tactical reality of force protection here. So the 82nd Airborne drops in, the 31st MEU secures the beaches, the terminal is taken, the operation is a massive success on day 1, but what does the operational environment look like on day 2?
On day 2, the U.S. military has effectively tethered thousands of its most elite troops to a static rock 15 kilometers off a hostile coastline.
And 15 kilometers is nothing.
In modern missile warfare, 15 kilometers is point-blank range.
It's essentially within line of sight.
It is. Iran does not need to organize a conventional amphibious assault to take the island back. They merely need to make the island uninhabitable.
Just bomb it constantly.
Exactly. They would utilize their massive disperse stockpiles of ballistic metals, cruise missiles, and loitering munitions, suicide drones.
So the logistics of keeping those U.S. troops alive quickly spiral into a nightmare. They are trapped on Kharg Island and require continuous daily resupply of food, fresh water, medical equipment, and ammunition.
Everything has to be brought in by sea or air.
Right. And how do you get a slow-moving transport ship to an island when the waters around it have been seeded with acoustic and magnetic naval mines?
You have to escort every single supply ship with minesweepers and destroyers.
Wow.
Which sounds fine until you look at the limits of those destroyers.
Yeah, explain the Aegis system, because the sources really dig into this vulnerability.
Sure. So the U.S. Navy uses the Aegis combat system on its destroyers. It's an incredibly sophisticated phased array radar designed to track and destroy incoming threats.
It's like a highly advanced shield.
Yes. But Aegis has a structural vulnerability known as magazine depth. A destroyer only has a certain number of vertical launch cells containing interceptor missiles, usually around 90 or so.
And once you shoot them all?
You're empty. And reloading those cells while at sea is notoriously difficult, if not flat out impossible, in an active combat zone. You usually have to go back to a friendly port.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So Iran doesn't need to actually sink the destroyer. They just need to launch enough cheap drones to force the destroyer to fire all of its interceptor missiles.
Just exhausts their ammo.
Exactly. Once the magazine is empty, the ship must withdraw, leaving the supply lines and the troops on Kharg Island entirely exposed.
That is terrifying.
It is. The attempt to, quote-unquote, surgically take a small island instantly demands the mobilization of massive naval armadas, round-the-clock air patrols, and complex medical evacuation corridors.
The surgical strike requires a sledgehammer just to maintain it.
Perfectly said.
So if the logistical and financial math of seizing Kharg Island is this heavily stacked against long-term success, why is the military option currently dominating the conversation?
To understand that, we have to look at the current practices of both nations. The diplomatic gulf between Washington and Tehran right now is currently unbridgeable.
Yeah, we have to examine the actual demands being placed on the negotiating table, because they really explain why both sides are locked into this military posturing.
Let's look at the U.S. demands first.
Okay, so the United States recently issued a 15-point proposal for sanctions relief. The core demands require Iran to completely and verifiably dismantle its nuclear program, entirely defund and dismantle its regional proxy network, guarantee the unconditional reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and accept strict permanent limitations on its ballistic missile development.
I mean, when you look at that list, the U.S. is essentially demanding the complete dismantling of Iran's entire national security apparatus.
Right. They are asking Iran to voluntarily give up every single point of leverage it holds in the Middle East.
And Iran's counter-demands are equally uncompromising. They are offering zero concessions regarding their nuclear or proxy programs. Zero.
None at all.
Instead, they are demanding full, immediate sanctions relief, the permanent closure of all U.S. military bases in the Persian Gulf region, massive war reparations, and binding security guarantees.
And the sources highlight one final Iranian demand that really just fundamentally alters the geopolitical landscape. Iran wants to establish a new regulatory order for the Strait of Hormuz that would grant Tehran the right to collect transit tolls from all commercial shipping.
They want to treat the Strait of Hormuz the way Egypt treats the Suez Canal.
Which is just wild to think about.
What's fascinating here is the sheer audacity of that demand and what it reveals about Iran's strategic confidence.
How so?
Well, the Suez Canal is a constructed waterway, right? Egypt built it, Egypt owns it. The Strait of Hormuz is a natural international maritime choke point. Iran demanding the right to tax global energy transit is an assertion of absolute regional hegemony.
It's them saying, we own the Gulf.
Exactly.
So neither side is presenting terms that the other can accept without committing political suicide.
Right. If the U.S. agrees to close its bases and allow Iran to tax global shipping, it basically abdicates its role as a global superpower and hands control of the world's energy markets to Tehran.
Never going to happen.
And if Iran agrees to dismantle its military and proxies, the regime exposes itself to domestic overthrow and regional irrelevance. Also, never going to happen. They are not negotiating. They are presenting ultimatums.
Because the diplomatic avenues are just walled off, military action becomes the only remaining language. But Iran's military vocabulary is very different from America's. We need to examine Iran's current practice of asymmetric escalation.
This is crucial. The American military is designed for decisive, overwhelming, symmetrical victories. Tank against tank, fighter jet against fighter jet.
Conventional warfare.
Right. Iran knows that playing that game results in their immediate destruction. They can't beat the U.S. Air Force in a dogfight. So their entire military architecture is built around survival, absorption, and what the analysts call escalation by disruption.
So they plan to get hit.
Iran has engineered its military to operate while sustaining massive damage. This is exactly why their missile launch facilities are buried deep inside mountains. It is why they rely on highly mobile, easily hidden launch vehicles instead of static bases.
And it's why they use proxies.
Exactly. It is why they have franchised their military power out to proxy militias across Yemen, Lebanon, and Iraq. They don't need to win a pitched battle. They just need to ensure that the battlefield is chaotic, geographically dispersed, and politically exhausting for their adversary.
Their ultimate weapon isn't a bomb, it is geography. And that brings us to the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20 to 30% of the world's total global oil consumption passes through this 21-mile-wide stretch of water.
It's the jugular vein of the global economy.
It really is. And when analysts discuss warfare in the Strait, the public often imagines these massive naval engagements, big ships firing at each other. But Iran's strategy there is entirely asymmetric. They do not intend to fight the U.S. Navy for control of the water.
No, they intend to target the economic viability of the water.
Right. We really need to trace the exact mechanism of how this works because it's brilliant in a dark way. Think of the Strait of Hormuz not as an ocean, but as the busiest, most vital multi-lane highway in the world, packed bumper to bumper with delivery trucks keeping the global economy alive.
Yeah.
Iran's strategy isn't to build a giant barricade and fight the police head-on. Their strategy is to have a single person stand on an overpass and just throw a handful of sharp nails onto the highway during rush hour.
That is a terrifyingly accurate analogy, because the physical damage of a few nails is minimal. Might pop a tire or two, but the psychological and economic damage is catastrophic.
Exactly. The moment those nails hit the asphalt, or in this case, the moment a single Iranian naval mine is detected in the water, or a single cheap drone strikes a commercial tanker, the mechanism of global finance just takes over.
Yeah, the shipping companies do not operate these $100 million oil tankers uninsured.
No way.
They rely on maritime insurance markets, primarily based in places like Lloyd's of London, to provide what's called war risk coverage.
Right, and normally war risk premiums are fractions of a % of the ship's total value. It's a routine cost of doing business. But the moment an asymmetric threat is confirmed in the Strait, those underwriters panic. The premiums spike by 500% or 1,000%.
Suddenly, a shipping company that was paying $50,000 to insure a voyage is being asked to pay $5 million.
The math simply stops working.
Right. They literally cannot afford to sail.
So the tanker companies refuse to sail. The trucks pull over to the side of the highway. The physical flow of oil drops by millions of barrels a day, creating this immediate artificial supply shock. The price of Brent crude oil skyrockets globally.
And within weeks, you, the listener, are paying an extra $2 for a gallon of gas.
Exactly. And the cost of every single consumer good transported by diesel trucks surges.
That is the power of asymmetric escalation. Iran's greatest strategic asset is its ability to weaponize the fragility of the global financial system.
They don't even have to fire a shot at an American ship.
They do not need to defeat the U.S. military to win. They simply need to inflict enough indirect economic pain on the American consumer that the political pressure on the U.S. government to end the conflict becomes insurmountable.
Which moves us into the terrifying future implications of this standoff. We are looking at Section 4. The escalation trap and the problem of thresholds.
This is where things get really dangerous.
Yeah, because the U.S. might be moving these 3,000 airborne troops and Marines into the region purely as a show of force. The intention might be entirely communicative, right? Like, look at the military capacity we have assembled, return to the negotiating table, or else.
But using deployment as leverage introduces a massive psychological vulnerability. The U.S. assumes it is sending a carefully calibrated signal of deterrence. But from Tehran's perspective, observing a fully armed Marine Expeditionary Unit and airborne brigade staging just across the border does not look like leverage.
What does it look like to them?
It looks like the final preparatory phase of a decapitation strike.
Wow. So the signal meant to prevent a war is the exact signal that triggers one.
That is the core mechanism of the escalation trap. Washington desires controlled, limited escalation to weaken Iran without committing to an occupation. Tehran desires to demonstrate that it cannot be coerced and that any attempt to violate its sovereignty will trigger a disproportionate, chaotic response.
Both sides think they're in control.
Exactly. Both sides believe they are carefully managing the dial on the conflict, but neither side can afford to let the other have the last word.
It is an algorithmic bidding war, where the rules of national survival dictate that neither state is allowed to bid zero. If the U.S. strikes a proxy, Iran must strike a base. If Iran strikes a base, the U.S. must strike a facility.
And the trap truly springs when we examine the concept of mission creep and political gravity.
Let's look at the theoretical timeline where the Kharg Island gambit is actually executed. The U.S. successfully lands troops and secures the terminal. It is designated a quote-unquote limited operation. But then an Iranian ballistic missile penetrates that Aegis defense umbrella we talked about, and American troops are killed on the island.
The tactical parameters of the mission instantly evaporate.
Right.
The operation is no longer about securing an oil terminal. It is about national prestige and superpower credibility.
The political gravity becomes immense.
It does. A U.S. president cannot order the military to abandon the island under fire. To retreat after taking casualties is to signal a catastrophic collapse of global deterrence.
So what do they do?
The only politically viable direction is forward. To protect the troops on the island, the U.S. military must begin launching strikes against the missile launch sites located deep inside mainland Iran.
And the moment American bombers are striking targets in the Zagros Mountains, the illusion of a limited island operation is dead. You are engaged in a major regional war.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see that the architecture of military planning often provides a false sense of control.
Leaders convince themselves that they can surgically intervene in a complex system without triggering cascading failures.
They believe they can control the pace of the escalation. But the brutal, mechanical logic of the battlefield, the necessity of force protection, the demand for retaliation, the domestic political requirement to project strength, it inevitably pulls them deeper.
It brings us to the ultimate strategic question posed by the analyses. The sources concede that the U.S. military absolutely has the sheer physical capability to put boots on the ground and seize a target like Kharg Island. The Marines and the airborne can take the rock.
It's not in question.
Right. But will executing that capability actually produce a durable, long-term strategic gain for the United States?
It is a profound paradox.
Mm.
Because if the objective is to permanently dismantle Iran's capacity to threaten the region, seizing a single island is insufficient. Iran's asymmetric capabilities, their proxies, their drones, their backup terminals, will survive and adapt.
So the limited operation fails to solve the underlying strategic problem.
Exactly. But conversely, if the objective is forced regime change or total capitulation, a limited operation will merely act as the spark that ignites the massive, uncontrollable regional war that the U.S. was explicitly trying to avoid by going limited in the first place.
You cannot solve a systemic problem with a tactical bandage.
No, you can't. The very concept of limited warfare against an adversary engineered for asymmetric escalation is a contradiction in terms.
So we've traced the lines from the 82nd Airborne loading onto C-17s, to the Aegis combat systems tracking drone swarms, to the massive $200 billion budget requests. What does this deep dive mean for you?
That's the real question.
It means that even if a full-scale, million-man invasion of Iran is physically off the table, the danger is far from over. The limited skirmish, the seizure of a tiny island, or the deployment of a few mines in the Strait of Hormuz contains the exact same economic destructive potential as a major war.
Because of the financial ripple effects.
Exactly. The moment the maritime insurance markets panic, the global supply chains you rely on will fracture. The cost of energy will spike, inflation will surge, and the geopolitical instability of the Persian Gulf will manifest directly at your local grocery store and gas pump.
We are all deeply structurally connected to the outcomes of these tactical decisions.
We really are. The blast radius of an asymmetric conflict is not measured in kilometers. It is measured in global economic contraction.
That's a sobering thought.
As we conclude this deep dive, we want to leave you with a couple of specific knowledge gap questions. These are mechanical concepts that you should explore on your own to better understand the news as it unfolds over the next few weeks.
What's the first one?
First, how precisely do global maritime insurance markets algorithmically react the moment a threat is detected in a choke point? Look into the structure of Lloyd's of London and the mathematics of war risk premiums. How quickly does a 1% premium increase translate into a global supply shock?
I highly recommend looking into that. It is a masterclass in the weaponization of finance.
It really is.
The second question I would urge you to investigate is historical. What precedents exist for a modern military successfully seizing and indefinitely holding a heavily bombarded, geographically isolated island right off a major adversary's coast?
That's a great question. Look at the logistical realities of amphibious resupply under constant missile threat.
The historical parallels are sobering.
They are. To close us out today, I want to hand it over for a final provocative thought built on the architectural flaws we've unpacked from the source material.
We have spent this time meticulously detailing the dangers of a limited operation spiraling out of control. We have mapped the escalation traps and the rigid reaction chains. But consider this fundamental question. If limited force is chosen specifically because a full-scale war is deemed politically and economically ruinous, but that limited force inevitably, mechanically triggers the exact full-scale reaction chain it was designed to avoid, does the concept of a limited operation actually exist in modern strategic warfare? Or is it merely a comforting illusion, a neat clinical narrative that political leaders sell to the public, and perhaps more disastrously, sell to themselves before the uncontrollable reality of combat inevitably begins?
An illusion of control right until the first missile fires. That is a chilling structural reality to consider. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We appreciate the opportunity to break down these complex mechanical realities alongside you. Keep questioning the surface narratives, keep looking for the underlying logistical truths, and we will catch you on the next one.